Visual C Sharp. We'll be looking at Chapter 1. In this chapter, what we'll be looking at is some of the terminology that we need to write a basic C Sharp program. In Chapter 1, there are a lot of things covered. They cover things which we really don't get into until the end of the semester. So what we're going to do is that we're going to look at the basics of what we need to do to start writing applications. So before we get started writing a program, let's look a little bit at what a program is. And a program is just a set of instructions that tells the computer what to do. We will be writing application software. Now there's system software, for example, Microsoft Windows. Windows is an operating system which controls your computer and allows us to run application software. There are the hardware devices that make up our computer, and we will write programs which will do things like send information to the printer, display information onto the monitor, allow input from the keyboard. So these physical devices, the ones that you can actually touch, we will be including those in our application software when we write it. A program is really nothing more than a series of ones and zeros. So all of these programs that you see, whether it's something controlling the electrical grid or software that runs your car or a program that does accounting, it boils down to they are just made of ones and zeros. I'm going to talk about two different pieces of hardware that come with your computer. One is called random access memory, and the other, let's say it's the hard drive. So say you buy a laptop from the store. They will ask you, how much RAM do you want with this? So you can vary the amount of random access memory that you can get with your computer. Same way with a hard drive that comes with your computer, where you store all of that information. When you first start your computer up, on your hard drive there is an operating system. Normally in this case we'll be using Windows. So Windows loads up from your hard drive, and it loads part of that into the random access memory. Random access memory is much faster, but it's also volatile. When you turn your computer off, everything is wiped out of random access memory, and you're just left with what's being saved onto the hard drive. So let's see how that information is stored on the hard drive or in random access memory. Computers only understand ones and zeros, so when we type something into the computer, it has to be compiled or translated and boiled down to ones and zeros. So for example, if I were to type the letter H into the computer in random access memory, or if we were to save it onto the hard drive, it's basically saved in ones and zeros. Now, back a long time, some of the early computers used vacuum tubes, and in a vacuum tubes are like little light bulbs. If the first vacuum tube was off, it was a 0. If the next one was on, it was a 1. The next one off, off, on, off, off. That would represent the letter capital H. So even today, that's how it's represented in the computer. But now, since we have solid state, we've reduced those thousands of vacuum tubes into something that you can put in the palm of your hand. And not just thousands, but now billions of these vacuum tubes into something that you can put in the palm of your hand. So information is stored in ones and zeros, and the reason in the very beginning, when you were writing a program, you would have to write ones and zeros. So can you imagine how difficult that must have been? So they came up with programming languages, and these programming languages allowed you to write things that looked more like English readable text. So it was much easier, and so you write it out in in these English-like statements, and then they're converted over to binary, to ones and zeros. So that's a much easier way to do it. So some things to take note of are this is the binary for the capital letter H. Let me back up and say this is lowercase h, and this is the binary for lowercase h, and it's a little different. Um, okay, so this is the word hello. This is what it looks like in binary. Now, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to press the space bar, and to the computer, that's what the space bar or space looks like. It's not nothing, it is an actual binary value. So remember that. When I press the enter key, that's the value for the enter key. Okay, so uppercase, lowercase are different. The computer sees it differently. Spaces, it sees that. Carriage returns. Anything that I type, on here is going to be represented by ones and zeros. Okay, so instead of writing our code in ones and zeros, we came up with higher level programming languages, and eventually one of those became C sharp. And what those do is those compile down. There's a separate program, which takes your code and translates it into something that your computer can understand. C Sharp is an object-oriented programming language, but we're not going to really worry about what all that means for now. What we're just going to do is learn the terms that we need so that we can write our applications, and then as we go through the course, we'll see what OOP is all about. There are a few terms that we will need to become acquainted with as we go through the course, and we'll be going over these many times. But one is class, another is object, another is method, another is variable. So C Sharp was stolen, or I'm sorry, it is similar to Java and similar to C or C++, and it's an object-oriented language. It is actually, if you've ever taken Visual Basic, even though you write the code a little bit different, they still compile down to the same thing. So they're very similar in that respect. So let's go ahead and start up Visual Studio and start writing some code. So from the previous exercises, you have Visual Studio up and running. And what I'm going to do is that I'm going to create a new C# program. So there's a couple different ways I can do this. One is to say File, New, Project. When it comes up, what I want to do is make sure that I have Visual C# selected, and let me collapse that down. And what I'm going to start off with first is that I'm going to start off with a console application. And by the way, there's a lot of code that's already written Visual Studio is an IDE, an integrated development environment where we can write all of our code. And what's behind it is something called the .NET Framework. And the .NET Framework is just a bunch of code that Microsoft has already written, but that we now have access to. So we don't have to write a lot of code. There's a lot of it already written for us. And the .NET Framework, this one as of today, the .NET Framework, the default that we're going to use is I'm going to use is 4.52. You'll see that there's a lot of previous versions and a lot of newer versions. Why would you want to use a previous version? Because you may be working with someone who may have used version 3.5. So you would want to use the .NET Framework 3.5 to write your code, and that way that both of you will have the same version of the .NET Framework when you're running your program. But I'm going to leave it at the default, and the default is really the latest stable version that we can all use, and so I'm going to leave it at whatever it defaulted at. Okay, so so the only thing I did was I chose Visual C Sharp. Out of the list over here, I'm going to choose console application, and it gives me a default name. I don't want that default name. I'm going to call this first one Hello World. I'm not going to put any spaces in there. I'm not going to start off with any numbers on this name. I'm not going to start off with any special characters. You can do those things, but for now, just to make sure that we stay out of trouble with our naming convention, I'm just going to use text. Okay, and I want to make sure I know where it's being saved at. This one is being saved in the projects folder. What it does is that it creates a folder, and I'm guessing you already know what folders are and how to use a folder and all that. But it creates a folder that allows you to save all of your programs. So this one says it's being saved in Visual Studio 2015 in the projects folder. Let me go to, so here's Visual Studio 2015. Here's my folder for that. If I drill down, I see there's a projects folder, and let me go ahead and create this. Inside of there, I'm going to go ahead and right now I'm going to say create a directory or folder for this solution, and I'm going to click OK. And Visual Studio went ahead and created some of the code for me. And if I look in my projects folder, I see now that I have a Hello World application that was created. And I can already, and I should be careful about this because I don't want this open at any, but I can drill down in here. I can see that there's a bunch of code that's already been written for me. Now let me back out of this and make sure that, okay. But there, it's already started. That's where all of my code that I'm going to write now is going to be stored at, in this folder, in my projects folder. Okay. Now, as you do this over and over again, this you'll become more accustomed to the screen and the different parts of it. But for now, let's just go over some of the basics. The first term I'm going to use is namespace. And namespace is just a name that says we have a bunch of code inside of namespace. And for now, this is the namespace that we're creating, and this is the code that we will be writing. So to get started, we say, I want to use some of the code that's already been written. And so there's a using statement that says we can use, there's a namespace called system, and system has a bunch of different things in it, and we have access to all of them. So once we say using system, we now have access to all of those things in the system namespace. Inside of these namespaces, and here's the beginning and end of the namespace. Inside of this namespace, we have one class. And class, whatever you thought the word class meant before, now it means a block of statements. So by default, it gives this class, this block of code, the name program. So we're going to leave it at program for now. And inside of this class, and here's the beginning and end of the class, inside of this class there is a method, and this is called a main method. And we'll look at what static and void and all these other things mean a few weeks from now. But for now, this is just a main method. So a method, and a method is inside of a class, and a class is inside of a namespace. So let's go ahead and put our code. I'm going to put my cursor right here and press the enter key, and I'm going to write a C# statement. I'm going to say in the system namespace there is, and I get something called an Intellisense, which helps me to write the correct commands as I'm writing my code. So it kind of gives me hints on what I want to do. And so I want to do system, and then there's a console window that I can use. And I want to, I'm pressing the period after each one of these, and I want to write a line to this console window. Now I press the parentheses, and it gave me the beginning and ending parentheses. Now it gives me a little red curly line, and it tells me, hey, I'm expecting a semicolon right here. And if I don't get it, I'm not going to run at all. It's not going to build, compile, or do anything unless it gets that semicolon. So I want to make sure that I've got a semicolon there, and that goes away. So this first statement, I'm going to say write a line of text to the console window, and all of those instructions for the console window are in the namespace called system. So what do we want to write to the, I'm putting double quotes inside of these parentheses, and this is what I want to write to that console window. I'm going to say, let me think of something. How about hello world? Okay, that's it. So that's my statement. Write this line, whatever's between these double quotes, to the console window. And all of this code for the console is located in the system namespace. Okay, now there's one more thing I need to do that's not in the textbook, and that is I'm going to press the enter key and add a new line. I'm going to make sure that everything is between this beginning curly brace and ending curly brace. That's in my main method. But I'm going to put another line in here, and again, this is system. I'm going to press the tab as a shortcut. Console, and there's a read line, and I'm going to put parentheses on the end of that, and again I need to make sure I put a semicolon on the end of that. And I need this because of the way that I'm going to run this program. So now that I've written that program, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to do debug and then start debugging. And what it's going to do is create a console window. It's going to first build and compile everything down. And that's what it did. This little window right here, and a window is any rectangle that shows up on your screen. In this window here, you may not be able to read it, but it says hello world. And then the next line, it's pausing. My cursor is flashing there. And what it's doing is it's waiting for this right here, which is console readline. In other words, readline means read something in from the keyboard. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to press the enter key. And that's what I'm going to read in. So it's waiting for me to do something to close the program. So I'm going to press the enter key. And that's it. That's it. I've written a program in C# that just says hello world. This may seem simple, but if you can do this, then you're well on your way to writing much more complex code. Now let me show you. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to highlight, and I can do this with my cursor, but I'm going to highlight this whole string of code. I'm going to do Control C to copy, and then I'm going to Control Victor or Control V to paste, and I'm going to do this, say, 3 times. Now, anything inside of these double quotes, it will print literally whatever you put inside of these double quotes, and including spaces. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to put in, I'm going to change these so that okay. So, yeah, what if I do this? Okay. So now I'm going to run this, and let's see what the difference is here. Let's see if it prints out literally what I have between these double quotes. Okay, so I'm going to debug, start debugging. Debug, start debugging, and when I do that, it does the console window, and it prints out literally what I told it to print between those double quotes. H, and then spaces, and then an H, and then this line, and then that line. So you, inside of the double quotes, you can put spaces in there, and it will literally put whatever you want to, whatever you type in between those double quotes. Now there's something called whitespace outside of these double quotes. Say on this line, what I can do is I can press the enter key a few times, and I can move this down a little, and I can move this one over this way, and maybe I can move this one over this way, and the program will run. Doesn't look very nice, but the program will still run. If I do debug, start debugging, the program will still run and still give me whatever results I told it to give me. So it'll still run. This is called whitespace, and it's outside of your statements. So these carriage returns, press the enter key, it doesn't care. It's called whitespace. And the compiler, when it runs, the compiler we'll just ignore Whitespace. But when you write your programs, you want your programs to look nice and clean, because that way they are readable. And if you write a program and 6 months later you come back to it, believe me, you want it to be readable. Okay, so that's the end of this lesson, and we will see about the second part later on.